August 24th, 410 AD. For the first time in 800 years, the impossible has happened. The gates of Rome, the Porta Salaria, have been thrown open, not in triumph, but in treachery. Inside, the citizens of the world's capital awaken not to the rising sun, but to the sound of trumpets, Gaelic trumpets, the trumpets of Alaric, king of the Goths. For 3 days the city burns. For 3 days the eternal city is subjected to the unthinkable. Palaces on the Aventine Hill, built with the plunder of 1,000 victories, are stripped bare. Temples whose ancient gods had long been forsaken are looted. The mausoleum of Augustus, tomb of the empire's founder, is broken open, his ashes scattered to the wind. When the Goths finally march out, heavy with gold and captives, they leave behind a city shrouded in smoke and an empire shrouded in shame. The world holds its breath. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, captures the global shock. The city which had taken the whole world, he laments, was itself taken. The world is rushing to ruin. It is the most famous date associated with the collapse of the Roman Empire. To understand the end, we must return to a time long before the Goths, to a moment when the empire almost tore itself apart, 200 years before its official death. We must go to the crisis of the 3rd century. Imagine an empire stretching from the sands of Syria to the misty wall of Scotland. 50 million people, one law, one currency, one emperor. This was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For over 2 centuries it had held. It seemed invincible, eternal. And then, in 235 AD, it broke. The assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander, a ruler who tried to negotiate with German tribes instead of paying his own soldiers, lit a fuse. The army, long the engine of Roman power, now became its cancer. The historian Cassius Dio had warned just years earlier, our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. He had no idea how right he was. What followed was 50 years of almost complete anarchy. This was the age of the barracks emperors. The rules were simple. Any general with a loyal army could try to become emperor, and almost every general did. In just 49 years, Rome had over 26 legitimate emperors. The average reign? Less than 2 years. Only one died of natural causes. The rest? Murdered, assassinated by their own troops, by their successors, by their bodyguards. The empire was a revolving door of ambition and assassination. Think of Emperor Maximinus Thrax, a 6'8" giant, a common soldier who rose through the ranks. He never even set foot in Rome. He ruled from his army camp on the Danube, bleeding the Senate dry to pay his troops, until those same troops, tired of his brutality, murdered him, his son, and put their heads on poles. Think of Emperor Valerian. In 260 AD, he led his army against the new Sasanian Persian Empire. He wasn't just defeated, he was captured. The Emperor of Rome, a living god on earth, taken alive. Persian propaganda shows him on his knees, King Shapur I looming over him. Legend says Valerian was used as a human footstool for the king to mount his horse. When he died, his skin was allegedly flayed, dyed red, and hung in a temple as a permanent warning. The shock to the Roman psyche was immeasurable. Their god had been captured. Their shield was broken. And with the emperors killing each other in a dizzying spiral, who was watching the borders? Nobody. The Franks and Alemanni surged across the Rhine, raiding deep into Gaul and even Spain. The Goths crossed the Danube, ravaging the Balkans. In the east, the Persians pushed deep into Syria. The empire, for the first time, was failing at its most basic task, to protect its citizens. But the most devastating wound wasn't from a sword. It was from the economy. How do you pay for this constant, empire-wide civil war? How does one general outbid another for the army's loyalty? You can't, not with real money. So they simply made more. The Roman denarius, the silver coin that was the euro or dollar of the ancient world, began to collapse. Under Emperor Augustus, it was nearly pure silver. By the time of Marcus Aurelius, it was about 75% silver. By the reign of Caracalla, 50%. But during the crisis, it fell off a cliff. Emperors washed copper coins in a thin silver coating and passed them off as real. It was state-sponsored fraud. By 270 AD, the silver denarius contained 0.5% silver. It was worthless. And the result? Hyperinflation. A measure of wheat that cost half a denarius in 200 AD cost 60 denarius by 270 AD. Prices exploded. Savings were wiped out. Trade ground to a halt. Why ship grain from Egypt to Rome if the money you'd receive would be worthless by the time you got it? A soldier's salary, once a respectable wage, was now a pile of junk metal. So they just took what they needed. Farms were looted. Towns were extorted. The Roman army, once the protector of the people, became their primary predator. The empire, as a single unified entity, ceased to exist. It was too big to manage, too broken to rule. It splintered into 3 separate Roman empires. In the west, the general Postumus declared the Gallic Empire, covering Britain, Gaul, and Spain. He created his own senate, his own consuls. In the east, the brilliant queen Zenobia of Palmyra carved out the Palmyran Empire, seizing control of Egypt, Rome's breadbasket, and all of the vital eastern provinces. The Roman Empire was now reduced to Italy and North Africa, ruled by a terrified emperor in Rome, besieged on all sides. This was the first true fall. In the 270s AD, the Roman Empire was for all intents and purposes dead. And yet, it didn't die. It was saved. Or perhaps more accurately, it was rebuilt into something else. It was saved by a series of ruthless, brilliant, iron-willed soldiers from the very frontier provinces that had been ravaged by war. Men like Aurelian, who, in a breathtaking series of campaigns, reconquered both the Gallic and Palmyran empires, earning him the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. But the man who truly ended the chaos and forged the new Rome was a soldier named Diocles, the son of a freed slave. We know him as Diocletian. When Diocletian took power in 284 AD, he looked at the shattered empire and diagnosed its illnesses with brutal clarity. 1, it was too big for one man to rule. 2, the succession was a bloody mess, inviting civil war. 3, the economy was a corpse. His solution was one of the most radical political experiments in history. It was called the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. Diocletian declared he was no longer a princeps, a first citizen like Augustus. He was Dominus, Lord, a living God. He wore a crown of pearls and robes of purple and gold. To approach him, one had to perform proskynesis, to prostrate oneself, face down on the floor. He was deliberately separating himself from the army to make the emperor too sacred to be so easily murdered. Then he split the empire in half. For the first time, the Roman world was formally divided into East and West. He would rule the East, the richer, more stable half. He appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, to rule the West, the poorer half, with the more dangerous frontiers. But he didn't stop there. He then appointed a junior emperor, or Caesar, for each senior Augustus. The two Caesars would be the heirs. When the Augusti retired, the Caesars would take their place and appoint new Caesars. 4 emperors, 4 capitals, all strategically placed on the frontiers, not in Rome. 4 mobile armies. The succession problem? Solved. The management problem? Solved. It was brutally efficient. It stabilized the borders. It ended the constant civil war. But this solution, this division, was the beginning of the end. The crack that Diocletian etched on the map of the empire would become a permanent, gaping fissure. The West, with its capital in Milan, and the East, with its capital in Nicomedia, began to drift apart. They developed different priorities, different enemies, and a different future. The West was already the junior partner, poorer, less urbanized, and bearing the brunt of the barbarian pressure on the Rhine and Danube. The East had the wealth of Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. Diocletian's solution had saved the idea of Rome, but it had sacrificed its unity, and it had planted the seed of the West's demise. He applied this same brutal logic to the economy. To stop hyperinflation, he passed the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD. It was a list carved in stone across the empire, setting the legal price for everything: a pound of pork, a pint of beer, a day's wages for a mule driver. The penalty for violating it? Death. It was a spectacular failure. Merchants simply stopped selling goods. A black market erupted. The law was unenforceable. But his other reform was far more sinister, and it stuck. To stop the tax base from collapsing, he issued a decree essential workers were no longer allowed to leave their jobs. A baker's son must become a baker. A soldier's son must become a soldier. And most critically, a colonist, a tenant farmer, was now forbidden to leave the land he worked. He and his children, and their children, and their children were tied to that piece of soil forever. Diocletian had saved the empire, but he had done so by creating what was in effect a new social order. He had invented serfdom. He had laid the first stone for the foundation of medieval feudalism. The price of saving the empire was to enslave it. The Tetrarchy, for all its brilliant cold logic, had one fatal flaw. It relied on men willingly giving up power. Diocletian did. In 305 AD, he became the first and only Roman emperor to voluntarily retire. He went to his massive palace in Split in modern-day Croatia to grow cabbages. But his system collapsed into civil war within a year. Music swells, dominated by a military drumbeat. Out of this chaos, one man emerged, a man who would set the empire on its final, irreversible course. The son of a tetrarch, fighting under a new and strange symbol, a cross. His name was Constantine the Great. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, Constantine smashed his rival Maxentius and seized control of Italy. He attributed his victory to the God of the Christians. With the Edict of Milan, he legalized Christianity. But he did far more than that. He patronized it. He built massive basilicas. He gave bishops the power of judges. He moved the empire's wealth into the hands of the church. This was a revolution. The old Roman state religion, the Pax Deorum, or peace of the gods, was based on a pantheon that protected the state. Now, the state was protected by one god. Historians still debate the impact. Did this new religion of peace fatally weaken the old Roman martial spirit? Did it create a new powerful bureaucracy, the church, that competed with the state for money and loyalty? Or was it the only thing left that could hold the fragmenting empire together? A new universal identity in a world where Romanness was becoming meaningless. Whatever the answer, Constantine's second act was even more profound than his first. He had reunited the entire empire, east and west, under his sole rule. He needed a new capital, a capital to honor his victory, his God, and his new vision. He did not choose Rome. Rome was a relic, a nest of old pagan senators and fading glory. He chose a strategically perfect ancient Greek city on the Bosporus Strait, Byzantium. He spent 6 years and a truly staggering fortune rebuilding it. He plundered the greatest temples of Greece and Egypt for its art. He built massive walls, a new senate, forums, and a hippodrome. And on May 11th, 330 AD, he dedicated it as Nova Roma, New Rome. The world would come to call it Constantinople. Music reaches a sorrowful, majestic peak. This was the final, decisive shift. The center of gravity, political, military, and economic, had now permanently moved east. The West, Italy, Gaul, Britain, Spain, was now just a backyard, a vast, increasingly poor, and dangerously exposed frontier. Constantinople was the new heart of the empire. It was protected by the sea on 3 sides and by the most massive walls ever built on the 4th. It would stand for another 1,000 years. Rome was left to die. He chose a strategically perfect ancient Greek city on the Bosporus Strait, Byzantium. And on May 11th, 330 AD, he dedicated it as Nova Roma, New Rome. The world would come to call it Constantinople. Constantine's solution had bought the empire time, but it had left the western half of the empire anemic and vulnerable. It was poor, its armies were stretched thin, and it was now staring down a new, terrifying threat. This threat was not the barbarians we think of, the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals. They had lived on the Roman border for centuries. They traded with Rome. They served in its armies. They often admired Rome. They didn't want to destroy it. They wanted to be part of it. No, the true catalyst was a force that emerged from the vast, unknown steppes of Central Asia, a force that terrified everyone, the Huns. In 370 AD, this nomadic confederation, a whirlwind of horsemen, appeared north of the Black Sea. Their origins were a mystery. Their appearance, to Roman eyes, was grotesque. Their skill in battle was inhuman. They were the masters of the composite bow, firing with terrifying accuracy from horseback. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote of them, "They are so prodigiously ugly and bent that you might think them two-legged beasts. They are glued to their horses. From their horses they buy and sell, they eat and drink, and they sleep." The Huns didn't invade the empire, not at first. They just pushed. They smashed into the Alans. They shattered the Ostrogoths. And in 376 AD, they fell upon the Visigoths, who lived along the Danube. The Goths, a proud warrior nation, were broken. Terrified, they did the only thing they could. They fled. A vast, panicked refugee column, men, women, children, entire wagons of families, perhaps 200,000 strong, arrived on the banks of the Danube, and they begged the Roman Emperor of the East, Valens, for asylum. This was a critical moment. Valens saw not a crisis, but an opportunity. 200,000 Goths. That meant tens of thousands of new potential recruits for his army, and new farmers to work the depopulated lands of the Balkans. He agreed. He would let them in. It was a disaster from the start. The local Roman governors, Lupicinus and Maximus, were corrupt and cruel. They saw the Goths not as refugees, but as a chance for profit. They stole the Goths' food supplies and sold them back at absurd prices. They sold them dog meat in exchange for Gothic children sold into slavery. Starving, humiliated, and finally enraged, the Goths did the inevitable. They revolted. And they were no longer refugees. They were a hardened army inside the empire's borders. Emperor Valens, arrogant and eager for his own military glory, rushed to confront them without waiting for his nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, to arrive with reinforcements. On August 9th, 378 AD, near the city of Adrianople, the Roman legions met the Gothic heavy cavalry. It was a slaughter. The Roman legions, the invincible infantry that had conquered the world, were encircled and annihilated. It was the worst Roman defeat since Cannae over 500 years earlier. 2/3 of the Eastern army was wiped out, and the Emperor Valens was killed on the field. His body was never found. Adrianople was more than a battle. It was a turning point. It shattered the myth of Roman invincibility forever. But more importantly, it established a new reality. A large, independent barbarian army was now living inside the empire, and it could not be defeated. It could not be dislodged. The new emperor, Theodosius, had no army left. He had to make a deal. He signed a treaty, a foedus, in 382 AD. The Goths were not subjects. They were allies, foederati. They were allowed to settle as a unified, autonomous nation within Roman territory. They would govern themselves by their own laws. In return,
They would fight for Rome. This was the fatal bargain. The Roman state had just outsourced its own defense. The Roman army was no longer Roman. From this moment on, the defense of the West would not be in the hands of Roman legionaries fighting for their citizenship and their state. It would be in the hands of barbarian mercenaries, Goths, Franks, Vandals, fighting for their next paycheck and for the warlord who paid them. The entire Roman army of the West was now effectively a collection of competing barbarian war bands, and the most powerful men in the Western Empire were no longer emperors. They were the barbarian generals who commanded these armies, men like Stilicho. Stilicho, a Vandal, a barbarian by blood, but more Roman than the Romans. He rose to become magister militum, master of the soldiers. He married the emperor's niece. When Emperor Theodosius died, he became the regent, the true ruler of the Western Empire, guardian of the weak, boy emperor Honorius. Stilicho was a brilliant general, and for 15 years he was the only thing holding the West together. In 402 AD, Alaric, the same Goth who would later sack Rome, invaded Italy. Stilicho raced his army from the Rhine, met him at Pollentia, and defeated him. In 406 AD, another massive Gothic horde under Radagius crossed the Alps and besieged Florence. Stilicho scraped together every last soldier, including slaves he had freed, and annihilated them. Stilicho was the shield of Rome, but he was a Vandal. And in the paranoid, failing court of the emperor, hidden away in the swamp fortress of Ravenna, the Roman senators whispered. They were jealous of his power. They were terrified of his barbarian origins. They accused him of plotting with Alaric. They accused him of wanting to put his own son on the throne. Emperor Honorius, weak and easily manipulated, listened, and in 408 AD, he signed his general's death warrant. Stilicho was arrested in a church and beheaded. It was an act of suicidal madness. The Roman elite, in a fit of racist paranoia, had just murdered the only man capable of defending them. The reaction was immediate. Stilicho's Roman army, which was in fact an army of 30,000 Goths, Huns, and Vandals loyal to him, either defected to Alaric or was massacred by the loyalist Roman troops. The shield of Rome was not just broken, it had been shattered by Rome itself. There was now nothing, no general, no army, nothing standing between Alaric and the city of Rome. 2 years later, Alaric stood at the Salutarian Gate. The sacking of 410 AD, the event that shocked the world, was not an act of barbarian aggression. It was the direct, inevitable result of Rome's own self-destructive political idiocy. The sacking of 410 AD was not the end, but it was the mortal wound. The psychological impact was devastating. The eternal city was mortal. The empire was mortal. And the physical consequences were catastrophic. The Western Emperor, Honorius, was a virtual prisoner in his fortress of Ravenna. He had no army. He had no money. He had no control. The empire was not falling. It was dissolving. In that same year, 410 AD, the Roman legion stationed in Britain had been recalled by Stilicho years earlier to defend Italy. The province, now suffering raids from Picts and Saxons, sent a desperate plea to Honorius for help, for soldiers, for protection. His reply is one of the most chilling documents in Roman history. It is known as the rescript of Honorius. It was not a promise of aid. It was not a plan for defense. It was a release. He told the cities of Britain to look to their own defenses. Think of what this meant. For 400 years, Britain had been Roman. Its cities, its laws, its language, its identity. And in a single sentence, the empire cut them loose. You are on your own. Roman Britain vanished. It descended into a dark age of warring petty kingdoms. And this was just the beginning. Piece by piece, the empire was letting go. Gaul was overrun by Franks, Burgundians, and the Visigoths, who were given the south of France as their own kingdom. Spain was seized by the Suebi and another barbarian group who were about to deliver the final, killing blow. The Vandals. The Vandals, under their brilliant, ruthless king Gaiseric, had been pushed through Gaul and into Spain. But Gaiseric knew he couldn't hold Spain. He looked south, across the Strait of Gibraltar, to the Roman province of Africa. Africa, modern-day Tunisia and Algeria, was not some distant colonial outpost. It was the lifeblood of the Western Empire. It was the personal breadbasket of the city of Rome. Its vast, fertile estates supplied the grain dole, the annona, that fed hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens for free. It was one of the few provinces in the West that still turned a massive tax profit. In 429 AD, Gaiseric led his entire people, 80,000 men, women, and children, across the strait. The Roman governor of Africa, Bonifacius, was in the middle of a civil war with the court in Ravenna. He was distracted. He was outmaneuvered. For 10 years, Gaiseric campaigned across the province, and in 439 AD, he captured the great city of Carthage. This was the real 476 AD. This was the moment the Western Roman Empire died. It just didn't know it yet. Gaiseric didn't just capture a province. He captured the Roman navy docked in the harbor, and he cut off the grain. The state went bankrupt instantly. The Western Roman Empire, as a functioning government, ceased to exist on that day. It no longer had the money to pay its armies. It no longer had the food to feed its capital. The annona, the sacred bond between the emperor and the people, was broken. The entire machinery of state, which existed solely to tax Africa and the remaining provinces, to pay for an army to defend those provinces, had collapsed. The empire was now nothing more than the Italian peninsula and parts of southern Gaul, and it was starving. The Vandals, a barbarian tribe, were now a Mediterranean naval power, and in 455 AD, they did what Alaric had done, only far more efficiently. Gaiseric sailed his new fleet right up the Tiber. The sacking of Rome this time was not a chaotic 3-day affair. It was a methodical, professional 14-day stripping of assets. They didn't just take gold. They took the imperial family as hostages. They took the golden menorah from the Temple of Jerusalem, which had been brought to Rome as a trophy 400 years earlier. The city of Rome was now just a hollowed-out husk, a symbol of a power that had vanished. The last 20 years, from 455 to 476 AD, are a ghost story. The Western Roman Empire was a phantom. The emperors were nothing. They were puppets. The real power was held by a succession of barbarian generals, the Magistri Militum. who ran Italy like a personal fiefdom. The most powerful of these was Ricimer, a half-Suebi, half-Visigoth general. He was known as the Kingmaker. From 456 to his death in 472, Ricimer was the state. He appointed and deposed emperors at will. When an emperor displeased him, he simply killed him. He appointed Majorian, a capable general. When Majorian grew too independent and failed in a campaign against the Vandals, Ricimer had him deposed, tortured, and beheaded. He appointed Anthimus, an Eastern Roman noble. When they quarreled, Ricimer marched on Rome, captured it, and had Anthimus dragged from St. Peter's Basilica and beheaded. These were the shadow emperors, pale ghosts haunting the ruins of the imperial palace, waiting for their barbarian master to give the next command. When Ricimer finally died, his power passed to another German general, a man named Orestes. Orestes, in 475 AD, decided to cut out the middleman. He deposed the legitimate emperor, and in a final, tragic-comic gesture, he named his own son as Emperor of the West. His son's name was Romulus, the name of the founder of Rome, and they gave him the nickname Augustulus, the Little Augustus, the Little Emperor. A boy, perhaps 15 years old. The history of the Western Empire begins with Romulus and Augustus, and it ends with Romulus Augustulus. This little Augustus ruled for 10 months. Orestes' own barbarian foederati army, a mix of Scyrians, Heruli, and other tribes, had not been paid. They demanded land. They demanded 1/3 of all estates in Italy. Orestes refused. So the army mutinied. They proclaimed their own leader, a Scyrian officer named Odoacer, as their king. Odoacer captured Orestes and, predictably, had him executed. He then marched on Ravenna. September 4th, 476 AD. The boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is in his palace. The barbarian general, Odoacer, walks in. There is no battle, no drama, no grand final speech. It is a resignation. Odoacer, a practical man, sees the boy is no threat. He doesn't kill him. He just pensions him off. He gives Romulus Augustulus a large villa near Naples and a generous annual income. The last emperor of the West goes into a comfortable retirement. And this is the real fall. It is the most anticlimactic event in history. Odoacer, now the king of Italy, looked at the purple robes, the diadem, and the scepter, the imperial regalia of the West, and he realized he had no use for them. He didn't proclaim himself emperor. He didn't appoint a new puppet. He just gathered them all up, put them in a box, and shipped them to Constantinople. He sent a message to the Eastern Emperor, Zeno. The message was simple. The West no longer requires an emperor of its own. Your sole rule is sufficient. Zeno, in return, accepted reality. He granted Odoacer the title of patrician and accepted him as the de facto ruler of Italy. And that was it. No one in Rome or Ravenna or Constantinople woke up the next day and said, the Western Roman Empire has fallen. They just carried on. The Senate still met in Rome, the consuls were still appointed, but everyone knew the power was gone. The empire was just a memory. The body had finally been pronounced dead.
So, why did Rome fall? It fell because it was no longer Rome. It wasn't a single event. It was a transformation. It fell because of its own internal decay, a crisis of the 3rd century that shattered its economy and its political unity, leaving it a hollow shell. It fell because its saviors, Diocletian and Constantine, in their desperate attempt to save it, split it in two, moving its heart, its wealth, and its future to the east, leaving the West a poor, dying limb. It fell because it could no longer afford or inspire its own citizens to fight for it, so it outsourced its defense to barbarian foederati, mercenaries who had no loyalty to the state they served. It fell because its own paranoid and corrupt political class murdered the very barbarian generals who were the only ones still defending it. And finally, it fell because in 439 AD, a Vandal king named Gaiseric captured Africa, its breadbasket, and cut off its life support. The barbarians, Alaric, Gaiseric, Odoacer, were not the cause of the fall. They were the symptoms. They were not barbarian invaders destroying a healthy society. They were the receivers in a bankruptcy. They were the inheritors of a state that had already collapsed from within. The fall of Rome was not the end of the world. It was the end of a world and the beginning of a new one. The Eastern Roman Empire, the one we call Byzantium, with its capital in Constantinople, would continue for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law and Greek culture. And in the West, the fall was just a transition. Odoacer would soon be replaced by Theodoric the Goth, who ruled Italy with a Roman Senate, preserving Roman culture. The Franks in Gaul would become France, the Visigoths in Spain, Spain. The only universal power left was the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. The Roman Church simply stepped into the power vacuum left by the Roman state. The administrative map of the empire became the administrative map of Christendom. Rome never truly fell. It simply became the foundations of the modern world. Its language became the language of law, medicine, and faith. Its laws became the basis for almost every legal system in the West. And its epic, tragic story of unity, power, decay, and collapse became the one great lesson that every empire since has been forced to study and to fear. The question is not why the Roman Empire fell. The question is, what have we learned from it? The Roman Church simply stepped into the power vacuum left by the Roman state. The administrative map of the empire became the administrative map of Christendom. Rome never truly fell. It simply became the foundations of the modern world. Its language became the language of law, medicine, and faith. Its laws became the basis for almost every legal system in the West. And its epic, tragic story of unity, power, decay, and collapse
became the one great lesson that every empire since has been forced to study and to fear. The question is not why the Roman Empire fell. The question is, what have we learned from it?